The Kang estate smelled like money and silence. Not the comfortable kind of silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of every sound your own body produces. The shuffle of my canvas sneakers against marble floors. The soft exhale I tried to keep controlled as I wheeled the linen cart down the east corridor at 6:15 in the morning. The faint clink of the silver polish bottles I hadn't properly secured before leaving the supply closet. I'd been working at the estate for 11 days. 11 days of learning which floorboards creaked near the study, which hallways were patrolled by men in dark suits who never smiled, and which rooms I was absolutely forbidden to enter under any circumstance. 11 days of keeping my eyes down, my movements efficient, and my curiosity buried somewhere so deep I almost convinced myself it didn't exist. Almost. My name is Clara Seo, 26 years old. Half Korean, half nothing special, raised in a cramped apartment in Flushing, by a mother who worked double shifts at a dry cleaner and a grandmother who pressed dried persimmons into my palms like they were currency. I took this job because the agency offered triple the standard rate and asked only 2 questions. Can you be discreet? And, do you have a problem with irregular hours? I said no to both. I needed the money so badly I would have said no to anything. The agency hadn't mentioned the guards. They were everywhere, stationed at corridor junctions like architectural features, standing beside doorways with the particular stillness of men, trained to look bored while remaining lethal. I had learned not to make eye contact with them. I had learned to move like furniture, to exist in the periphery of this world without disturbing its surface. Mrs. Yoon, the head of household staff, had briefed me on my first morning with the efficient coldness of someone who had given the same speech many times. 3rd floor is restricted. You will never go to the 3rd floor unless explicitly summoned. You will complete your assigned rooms, the guest suites on the 2nd floor and the formal rooms on the ground level. And you will be finished and out of the main house before 8 a.m. You will not speak to Mr. Kang. You will not look directly at Mr. Kang. If Mr. Kang enters a room you are cleaning, you will excuse yourself immediately and quietly. I had nodded. I had understood. I had not yet seen Mr. Kang. In 11 days, he had been a presence felt rather than observed, a disturbance in the atmosphere of the house, the way a change in barometric pressure announces a storm before a single cloud appears. The staff moved differently when he was home versus when he was traveling. Spines straightened, voices dropped. Even the guards, already rigid, seemed to calcify further. This morning felt different, though I couldn't have explained why. The air carried something metallic beneath the usual scent of fresh flowers and cedar, a tension that hadn't been there yesterday. 2 guards I'd never seen before were stationed at the base of the main staircase instead of the usual one. Through the tall windows facing the motor court, I counted 3 black SUVs where normally there was one. I focused on my cart. Guest Suite 4 needed fresh linens. The formal dining room required polishing, and the south sitting room had a window that Mrs. Yoon had noted was leaving condensation rings on the sill that needed addressing. I was a list of tasks. I was efficient and invisible. I pushed the cart into the formal sitting room first, because the light was best in the early morning, and I preferred to do the detailed work when I could see clearly. The room was immaculate, in the way only rooms that are never truly lived in can be. Every surface curated, every object placed with the precision of a museum installation. There was a large arrangement of white orchids on the center console table, a painting above the fireplace that I was fairly certain cost more than my mother's entire apartment building, and a low-glass cabinet along the far wall that contained what appeared to be an antique tea ceremony, set displayed behind locked glass. I had just begun dusting the mantelpiece when I heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the measured, deliberate tread of the guards. Something different, assured but unhurried. The footsteps of someone who has never once in his life needed to rush, because the world has always waited for him. I didn't turn around. I kept my cloth moving along the marble edge of the mantel, my back to the doorway, my heartbeat accelerating in a way I told myself was simply the startled response of someone caught off guard. Then I heard the faint rustle of fabric. Close. Much closer than the doorway. He had entered the room. "Excuse yourself immediately and quietly." Mrs. Yoon's voice was very clear in my memory. I set down my cloth, turned carefully, and finally saw Kang Junho for the first time. He was standing near the window, and the early morning light was doing something unfair. Catching the sharp architecture of his face, the clean line of his jaw, the dark sweep of his hair with a precision that made him look almost unreal. He was younger than I'd imagined. 30, perhaps 32 at most, with the kind of still, controlled face that revealed nothing involuntarily. He wore a charcoal suit that fit with surgical precision, and at his collar, a deep burgundy tie hung slightly, imperfectly, askew. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his phone, one hand pressed to his ear, speaking in low Korean that I caught only fragments of. Words about timing, about confirmation, about something that needed to happen before noon. His other hand held a small ceramic cup of what smelled like barley tea. And in the morning quiet, I could hear the almost imperceptible tightness in his voice beneath the calm exterior. Something was wrong. Something was wrong in this house today, and whatever it was, it lived in the set of his shoulders and the micro-tension around his eyes. I began moving toward the door. I was nearly there, 3 steps, maybe 4, when my cart caught on the edge of the Persian rug in a way I hadn't anticipated, lurching sideways with a sound that shattered the room's silence like glass dropped on stone. The silver polish bottles collided. The folded linens toppled. And I, overcorrecting too quickly, knocked my elbow directly into the tall standing lamp beside the doorway. It swayed. For one suspended, terrible second, I watched it arc toward the glass cabinet with the antique tea set. I caught it. Both hands, lunging sideways, the metal base cold and trembling against my palms. The lamp's shade askew, but the whole thing upright, saved barely by pure reflex. The room was absolutely silent. I straightened slowly, the lamp gripped in both hands, and made the mistake I'd been carefully avoiding for 11 days. I looked directly at Kang Junho. He had lowered his phone. He was watching me with an expression that was impossible to decipher. Not anger, not amusement, not the cold dismissal I had braced for. Just attention. Complete, undivided, measuring attention, as though I had become the most interesting problem in the room. His tie was still crooked. I have no explanation for what happened next, except that 11 days of hypervigilance had apparently done something strange to my survival instincts. Because instead of excusing myself and retreating, I heard my own voice, quiet, steady, entirely without my permission, say, "Your tie is crooked." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I watched his expression shift, not dramatically, not the way emotions move across ordinary faces. It was more like watching still water register the faintest disturbance at its surface, a microscopic recalibration behind his eyes. And then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more contained than that. Something that made the air in the room feel thinner. He said nothing. I should have left. Every rational instinct I possessed was screaming at me to set the lamp down, murmur an apology, and remove myself from the room with whatever dignity remained. Mrs. Yoon's voice was a siren in the back of my mind. "You will not speak to Mr. Kang. You will not look directly at Mr. Kang." And I was currently doing both simultaneously, while still holding his floor lamp, like an offering. I set it down carefully, straightened the shade. And then, because apparently my self-preservation had completely abandoned me, I crossed the distance between us in 4 quiet steps and reached up toward his collar. I felt him go very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the controlled stillness of a man who has trained himself to remain motionless in situations that might otherwise provoke reaction. Up close, he was even more unsettling. The faint scent of him reached me. Cedar, and something darker beneath it, like rain-soaked earth, expensive and grounded at once. There was a small, faded scar along his left jawline, barely visible against the clean line of his skin. His eyes, this close, were not simply dark. They were the particular deep brown of old lacquered wood, and they were fixed on the middle distance with a deliberateness that told me he was choosing very carefully not to look down at me. My fingers found the narrow silk of his tie. It was burgundy, I confirmed, a deep arterial red. And the fabric was heavier than I expected, a quality that translated immediately through my fingertips into the recognition of something I had never owned and never would. I adjusted the knot with the same efficiency I applied to every task in this house. Small correction to the left, straighten the blade, press the dimple lightly back into place beneath the knot. 3 seconds. 4 at most. I stepped back. His gaze dropped to meet mine then. Direct, immediate, and so fully focused that I felt the physical impact of it somewhere behind my sternum. In the morning light, with the white orchids enormous and silent behind him, Kang Jun-ho looked at me, the way I imagined people looked at things they were trying to memorize. "You're new," he said. His English was precise and unaccented in the way of someone who learned the language from books before they learned it from people, each word placed with care, nothing wasted. 11 days, I said, because for some reason the exact number seemed important to establish. Something moved behind his eyes. He glanced once at the overturned items on my cart, the spilled polish bottles, the disorganized linens, and back to my face, and did not comment on any of it. "Clara," he said. Not a question. He already knew my name, and the knowledge that he did sent something cold sliding down the back of my neck. I nodded. He looked at me for one more moment, the measuring quality of his attention unchanged, and then his phone vibrated in his hand. He glanced at the screen, and something in his face closed, shuttered completely, the way a room goes dark when every light is extinguished at once. Whatever I had briefly been permitted to witness disappeared behind a composure so total it was almost architectural. He turned toward the corridor. I began restoring my cart to order, hands moving mechanically, trying to process what had just happened. Through the tall windows, I could see the motor court below. The 3 black SUVs still idling, their tinted glass revealing nothing. One of the drivers was standing beside the middle vehicle, speaking into a phone. 2 guards flanked the main entrance. I collected my polish bottles, refolded the linens. The morning continued, slow and procedural, and I told myself that the encounter in the sitting room had meant nothing, that I was staff, that men like Kang Jun-ho noticed staff the way they noticed furniture, briefly, functionally, and not again. I told myself this with great conviction for approximately 4 hours. By midday, I had finished my assigned rooms and was returning my cart to the supply corridor on the ground floor when I passed the motor court entrance, a side door near the kitchen that the household staff used to move between the main house and the service buildings. Through its narrow window, I saw the vehicles were still there. The same driver I'd observed that morning was standing beside the middle SUV. I don't know what made me look more carefully. Perhaps it was the accumulated tension of the morning, the doubled guard presence, the metallic something in the air that hadn't dissipated. Perhaps it was simply that after 11 days of training myself to notice everything without appearing to notice anything, the habit had become involuntary. He was young, this driver. Dark jacket, close-cropped hair, the expressionless face of someone employed to project neutrality. But his right hand, I now saw, was not resting at his side the way a waiting driver's hand typically rests. It was positioned with a particular intentionality at his hip, the jacket there hanging oddly, weighted in a way that fabric alone doesn't produce. I stood very still behind the narrow window. He wasn't one of the regular drivers. I knew the regular drivers. Mr. Park, with his reading glasses perpetually pushed up onto his forehead. Mr. Lim, who always drank from a thermos that smelled of instant coffee, and who hummed quietly to himself when he thought no one could hear. I had catalogued them, the way I had catalogued everything in this house, because invisibility required complete awareness of one's surroundings. This man I had never seen before today, and the vehicle he was standing beside, the middle SUV, positioned to be the natural choice for the primary passenger, had a front left tire that, when I looked carefully, sat at a fractionally unnatural angle, not flat, not visibly damaged, but angled in a way that the other 3 tires were not. My pulse was doing something erratic and unhelpful. "This is not your concern," I told myself firmly. "You are here to clean rooms. You fold linens and polish silver, and you do not involve yourself in anything that occurs beyond the edges of your assigned tasks." I pushed my cart forward, and then I heard, from the main corridor just ahead of me, the distinctive sound of Junho's footsteps, that unhurried, certain tread, accompanied by the lower sound of a guard briefing him in quiet Korean, and beneath it, the soft beep of an exterior door being unlocked. He was heading to the motor court. I stood in the service corridor, my cart handle in both hands, and I thought about 11 days of rent already paid in advance, and 3 more weeks remaining on my trial period, and my mother's voice telling me over the phone last week that she'd had to push back her eye appointment again because of the cost. Then I thought about the driver's hand and the weight at his hip, and the tire that didn't sit right. The door at the end of the corridor beeped as it unlocked. I left my cart, and I moved. I came through the side entrance just as Junho reached the motor court steps, his guard 1 pace behind him, the middle SUV's back door already being opened by the driver whose hand had not moved from his hip. "Mr. Kang." My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. He stopped, turned. The guard turned with him, and the expression on the guard's face when he saw me, a maid, in a service apron, who had apparently followed his principal outside, was the specific expression of a man deciding how quickly to intervene. Junho raised 1 hand, almost imperceptibly, and the guard went still. His eyes found mine across the stone steps, and in them was that same complete, focused attention from the sitting room, but sharpened now, quieter and more dangerous, because we were outside, and the air was open, and there were too many unknown variables around us. I walked toward him. I kept my voice low. I held his gaze because looking away felt, in that moment, like a form of abandonment. "Your driver has a gun," I said, "and I don't think he's yours." A beat of absolute silence passed over the motor court. Then Junho looked at me. Really looked at me. The way he had in the sitting room, but with an intensity that made that earlier moment feel like a rehearsal. And something behind his eyes changed in a way I couldn't name and would spend a long time afterward trying to. He did not get in the car. The hours that followed existed in a different texture of time. Not the slow, procedural rhythm of my mornings in this house. The measured progress from room to room, task to task, the comfort of knowing exactly what came next. This was time compressed and then stretched, folded back on itself in ways that made the sequence of events difficult to reconstruct later with any precision. What I remember most clearly are not the actions, but the sensations. The cold stone of the motor court beneath my thin sneakers, the sound of rapid Korean, spoken in low, clipped tones by men who moved with sudden purpose, and the particular quality of Junho's hand at my elbow, as he guided me back through the side entrance, with a grip that was not rough, but permitted absolutely no interpretation other than "you are coming with me now." The driver, the one I had identified, was detained before he reached the vehicle's door handle. I did not see exactly how it happened. I was already inside. What I understood, pieced together from the fragments I overheard in the following hours, was this. The man had been placed by a competing organization, inserted into the household's peripheral staff rotation through a forged service credential. The middle SUV had not been tampered with mechanically. The tire had been my misreading of an angle, I later realized, embarrassed. But the driver himself had been the instrument. What he'd intended beyond that point, I was not told, and I understood that I would not be told. This world did not explain itself to its edges. I was its edge. I had been its edge for 11 days, and I had intended to remain so. Mrs. Yoon found me in the staff sitting room 40 minutes after the incident, where I had been placed, not unkindly, but with the finality of a decision already made, by one of the guards. She set a cup of hot barley tea in front of me without comment. Her face, always composed, held something new in it now when she looked at me. Not warmth, exactly. More like a recalibration of category. "Mr. Kang would like to speak with you," she said, "when you're ready." I wrapped both hands around the cup. The ceramic was almost too hot, and I held it anyway, grateful for the specific reality of the sensation. "I'm ready," I said. He received me in the study on the 2nd floor, not the restricted 3rd floor, but a room I had cleaned twice, and therefore knew. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk of dark walnut that occupied the room's center with the authority of a geographic feature, 2 low chairs positioned near the window overlooking the garden. The afternoon light had shifted to a deeper gold by then, and it lay across the room in long, warm panels that softened nothing about the space's essential formality. Junho was standing when I entered. He had removed his jacket. The burgundy tie, the one I had straightened that morning, which now felt like it had happened in a different chapter of my life, was still in place, still perfect, and the sight of it produced in me a feeling I chose not to examine. He gestured to one of the low chairs. I sat. He remained standing for a moment, then settled into the chair opposite mine with the controlled ease of a man who makes every physical choice deliberately. On the desk behind him, 2 phones rested side by side. Near the door, a guard had positioned himself with the architectural stillness I had grown accustomed to, present enough to be a reminder, distant enough to simulate privacy. "Tell me what you noticed," Junho said. "Not thank you. Not are you all right?" A direct request for information, delivered in that precise, careful English, his eyes on my face with an attention that made the room feel smaller than its dimensions suggested. I told him. The hand position, the jacket's weight on the right side, the fact that I had not recognized him from the regular rotation of staff I had catalogued in 11 days of careful observation. I told it plainly and in order, the way I reported anything, a damaged item, a room that needed additional attention, because plain and ordered was the only way I knew how to manage things that frightened me. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You catalog the drivers," he said. "I catalog everything," I said. "It helps me do my job." Something shifted in his expression. The faintest loosening of the controlled surface. There and then gone so quickly I might have constructed it. "Where did you work before this?" he said. "Various placements through the agency. Hotels mostly. 1 private residence in Connecticut." "Why did you leave Connecticut?" The question was quiet and without obvious pressure, which somehow made it more difficult to deflect than a direct demand would have been. "The family relocated," I said, which was true as far as it went. He accepted this without pursuing it, which told me he already knew the fuller answer and was offering me the courtesy of not requiring me to say it aloud. That particular form of consideration, delivered so casually, was more disorienting than anything else that had happened today. "You'll be moved to a different assignment within the house," he said, "effective tomorrow." I looked at him. "The guest suites and formal rooms are managed adequately by the current rotation," he continued, his tone carrying the mild precision of someone reading from an internal document. "There are rooms on the 2nd floor, the private library, the morning room adjacent to the main corridor, that require more consistent attention. The 2nd floor, the floor where his study was, where his private rooms were." "That's not necessary," I said. The guard near the door did not move, but I had the distinct impression that my saying "that's not necessary" to Kang Junho was not something that occurred with any regularity in this house, and that its occurrence now had registered somewhere in the room's atmosphere. Junho looked at me with that steady, unreadable attention. "It's already arranged," he said. 3 weeks passed. They passed in the way that periods of sustained hypervigilance pass, simultaneously endless and compressed, each day too full of small observations and adjustments to feel short, but the accumulation of them blurring into a texture rather than a sequence when I tried to look back. My new assignment placed me in the second floor's quieter wing each morning. The private library was a room I had not previously entered, and it undid me slightly the first time. 2 stories of shelved books, a rolling ladder on a brass rail, skylights that let the morning arrive in clean geometric panels. I cleaned it with the particular care I reserved for things that seemed to deserve it, and I told myself this was professionalism rather than anything more complicated. I saw Junho daily, not always directly, sometimes only as a presence registered through sound, his voice on the phone in the adjacent study, or footsteps in the corridor, or the small evidence of recent occupation in a room I entered. A cup not yet cold, a book left open at a marked page, but often enough that the quality of my awareness of him stopped feeling like alarm and began feeling like something else I hadn't named yet. He spoke to me in the mornings, when our paths intersected, never at length, always with that deliberate, considered quality. Questions about the house, about whether I needed anything for my tasks, observations about the library's organization that were genuinely knowledgeable and suggested he actually used the room rather than simply owning it. He remembered what I told him. This was what I noticed first, that if I mentioned something in passing, he retained it with a precision that was both attentive and faintly unnerving. The staff noticed too. I felt it in the way Mrs. Yoon's assessments of my work became slightly more formal, in the particular silence that fell among the other housekeepers when I entered the supply room. I was being recategorized again, and I wasn't entirely sure into what. Then came the Thursday when I was finishing in the morning room and heard, through the corridor window, a sharp exchange of voices in the motor court below. Not Korean. One voice Korean. One accented English, both taut with controlled anger. I did not look. I continued folding the room's throw blankets with mechanical care. But I heard Junho's voice drop to its quietest register, which I had come to understand, in 3 weeks, was not a sign of reduced intensity, but of its opposite. And I heard the English voice cut off as though a switch had been thrown. Then footsteps, ascending. He came into the morning room still carrying whatever the conversation had left in his body. A charge, almost visible, in the set of his shoulders, and the precise way he stopped just inside the doorway and looked at me. I set down the blanket. Clara. Just my name. But in the way he said it, like something he was confirming was still in its place. Something tugged behind my ribs that I had been carefully not acknowledging for 3 weeks. "The man in the motor court," I said carefully. "Is there something I need to know about the house today?" He crossed the room, stopped closer than he usually stood, the distance between us reduced to something that required active management of my breathing, and looked at me with that complete, measuring attention. "No," he said. "You're safe." The words landed with a weight completely disproportionate to their simplicity, and I understood, standing in the gold morning light of a room I had been assigned to because he had arranged it, that "you're safe" was not a casual reassurance. It was a declaration. And I was in far more trouble than I had realized. The declaration lived in me for days like a splinter, small, specific, impossible to ignore. I went about my work with the same efficiency I had always maintained. I dusted the library shelves in their proper order. I arranged the morning room with the care it deserved. I exchanged the necessary pleasantries with Mrs. Yoon, and kept my interactions with the other staff pleasant and unremarkable. On the surface, I was exactly what I had always been in this house: methodical, quiet, invisible where invisibility was appropriate. Beneath the surface, I was conducting a continuous internal argument with myself that I was losing badly. "You are staff," I reminded myself each morning as I pinned my hair back in the small mirror of the staff quarters. He is the employer. The distance between those two positions is not navigable, and the fact that he says your name like he's checking that something valuable is still in its place does not change the fundamental architecture of the situation. This was entirely reasonable. I believed it completely. It made no difference whatsoever. The Thursday incident with the man in the motor court had not been explained to me further, but its aftermath was visible in the house's atmosphere for the following week. An additional guard rotation added to the East Wing, 2 new faces in the staff that had the particular stillness of men whose employment was not primarily domestic. Junho's schedule, which I had learned to read through the house's behavioral patterns rather than any direct information, became less predictable. Some mornings the motor court was empty, and the second floor held only its usual quiet. Other mornings I arrived to find evidence of very early departure, his study already occupied and vacated before 6, the faint remainder of his particular cedar and dark earth scent in the morning room, where he'd taken his tea standing, too pressed for time to sit. On those mornings, I found myself pausing longer than necessary in the doorway. The awareness of this pause was not comfortable. It was on a Tuesday, overcast, the light through the library skylights a flat and even gray, when the situation shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was on the rolling ladder, returning a set of volumes to the upper shelves, when I heard the library door open. I registered the footsteps as Junho's without needing to look. I had apparently memorized the precise weight and rhythm of them, without ever consciously deciding to. And I continued my task, expecting him to cross to the desk and begin his calls as he sometimes did in the early morning. Instead, the footsteps stopped directly below the ladder. I looked down. He was standing at the ladder's base, one hand resting lightly on the brass rail, looking up at me with an expression that was different from his usual composure. Not less controlled. Nothing about Junho was ever less controlled. But the control was being applied to something more visible than usual, something closer to the surface. "You've reorganized the East section," he said. "By publication date within each author," I said. "The previous arrangement mixed editions inconsistently. I hope that's acceptable." "It's better," he said. And then, without transition, "Come down." I descended. When I reached the bottom rung and turned, he was closer than I'd expected. Not crowding, but deliberately present, the way he occupied space when something had his full attention. "There's an event Friday evening," he said, "at the house. 30 guests, catered, formal. Mrs. Yoon will have the assignments. You won't be working the event," he said. I looked at him. "I don't understand." He held my gaze with that steady, undeflectable attention. "You'll be a guest." The word landed so incorrectly in the context of everything I understood about my position here that I actually processed it as a mishearing for a full second before my brain corrected itself. "Mr. Kang Junho," he said. Quietly, but with a finality that suggested this was not the first time he'd decided something and simply waited for the other person to catch up. I stared at him. Every sensible, grounded, practical part of me understood that this was the moment to decline with grace and reestablish the appropriate distance. I had rent paid through the end of the month. I had a trial period to complete. I had a life constructed carefully around the principle of not wanting things I couldn't afford to want. "That would be inappropriate," I said. "Probably," he agreed, without any indication that he considered this a counter-argument. "I'm your employee. Currently." The single word opened a door I hadn't realized was in the wall, and I felt the draft from it across my entire understanding of the past 3 weeks. "What does that mean?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, but choosing, the way he always chose. "It means that what you are to this house, and what I would prefer you to be, are becoming difficult to reconcile, and I'm not accustomed to leaving problems unresolved." The library held its breath around us. Rain had begun against the skylights. a soft, persistent sound that made the room feel further from everything else than it actually was. "You don't know me," I said. "I know you noticed a threat in 11 seconds that my security team missed," he said. "I know you reorganize bookshelves by publication date because inconsistency bothers you. I know you took this position because you needed money, and that the situation in Connecticut was not simply a relocation." A pause. "I know you pause in the doorway of the morning room on the days I've left early." The heat that moved through my face was immediate and complete. "That's surveillance," I said, and heard the slight unsteadiness in my own voice. "That's attention," he said. "There's a difference." I turned away from him, not fleeing, I told myself, just needing the physical break of not being directly inside that gaze, and moved to the window overlooking the rain-soaked garden. The roses below were bowed under the weight of the water, heavy and dark red, and I stared at them and tried to locate the part of myself that was reasonable and unmoved. It was harder to find than usual. "The people at your Friday event," I said, to the garden. "They would know exactly what I am." "Yes," he said. "They would know you're someone I've chosen to have there. That would put me in a position I'm not equipped for." I heard him move, not toward me, but to the desk, a deliberate choice of distance that I recognized as a form of consideration. "You're more equipped than you believe, but I won't force the question. The invitation is there if you want it." I turned back. He was at the desk now, one phone already in hand, his composure fully restored to its usual seamless surface. The conversation apparently was completed on his end, filed away with the same clean efficiency he applied to everything. But his eyes, when they met mine across the rain-gray library, held something that his composure hadn't fully absorbed. I left without answering. I didn't sleep well that week. Friday arrived gray and then clearing, the late afternoon light turning amber across the estate's formal gardens as the catering staff moved through the ground floor with the purposeful choreography of a well-rehearsed production. I watched from the window of my staff quarters, dressed in my ordinary clothes, my hair loose, telling myself every 20 minutes that I had made the correct decision. Mrs. Yoon knocked at 5:30. She held, across her arm, a dress. Navy silk, simply cut, with the particular understated quality of something expensive enough not to need announcement. She looked at me with her composed, recalibrated expression and said nothing. Because nothing needed to be said. I took the dress. The event was everything I'd anticipated and nothing I'd been able to actually prepare for. 30 guests became the backdrop against which I understood, with escalating clarity, the specific nature of the world Junho moved through. These were not simply wealthy people. They were people for whom wealth was merely the ambient condition of existence, who spoke about things in the casual shorthand of those who have never needed to explain their context to anyone. I held a glass of wine I barely touched, and stood near the garden doors, and observed with the trained attention that was, apparently, my most consistent characteristic. Junho found me within 10 minutes of my arrival. He appeared at my side with the unhurried certainty of someone who had always known exactly where I was in the room, which I realized was precisely the case. He stood beside me, not touching, but close enough that his arm was a presence against the edge of my awareness, and the cedar and dark earth scent of him was immediate and specific. "You came," he said. "I'm observing," I told him. Professionally. The almost smile appeared, that contained minimal movement at the corner of his mouth that I had catalogued as carefully as everything else in this house. "Of course." We stood together at the edge of the room, and I watched the guests watch us, and I felt the recategorization happening in real time. 30 pairs of eyes absorbing the information of my proximity to him and drawing conclusions I couldn't control. A woman approached. Late 40s, immaculate, with the specific quality of someone accustomed to occupying the center of any room she entered. She looked at me with a smile that had architecture behind it, designed to appear warm while functioning as assessment. "Junho," she said. You didn't mention you were bringing someone. I don't announce everything, Minjung-si, he said, pleasantly, in a tone I had come to recognize as his most dangerous register. Her eyes moved to me with undisguised evaluation. And you are? Clara, I said. Clara works in the house, Minjung said, with a smile that sharpened at its edges. How lovely. Junho's arm moved. Not dramatically, just the subtle shift of his position that brought him fractionally but unmistakably closer to my side. A physical sentence addressed not to me, but to the woman across from us. Clara, he said, knows this house better than anyone in this room, including me. The warmth that moved through me at those words was more unsettling than any danger I'd encountered in this house. Because I understood, standing in the amber light with 30 witnesses and a navy silk dress that hadn't been mine until an hour ago, that the golden cage Kang Junho was constructing around me was not built from locks or orders, or the kind of power I'd feared when I first walked through his gates. It was built from attention, from remembering, from standing half an inch closer when someone looked at me with edges in their smile. And I had no idea yet whether I wanted to find the door. The morning after the event, I found a single white orchid on the windowsill of the library. Not arranged. Not displayed with the careful intention of the house's other flowers. Just placed, simply, almost privately, on the stone ledge where the rain light came in clearest. No note, no explanation required. I stood in the doorway for a long moment looking at it. And then I went to work. And I did not mention it to anyone. And I thought about it for the rest of the day with an intensity that alarmed me. The weeks that followed rewrote the geography of my life in this house so gradually that I couldn't identify the precise moment the rewriting began. What I could identify were the coordinates of the new map. Junho appearing in the library, not only for calls and work, but occasionally simply to read, occupying the chair nearest the window with a book, while I moved through the room's tasks. The silence between us acquiring a quality that was no longer professional, but had not yet been named. Meals left outside my staff quarters door on evenings when the house ran late. Small, considered things. Barley rice and the particular braised fish that I had mentioned once in passing was what my grandmother used to make. He listened with his whole self. This was the thing I hadn't expected and couldn't defend against. When I spoke, Junyo Kang was not waiting for his turn. He was actually receiving what I said, storing it, returning it to me later in ways that demonstrated comprehension so complete it felt almost intimate. I was in serious difficulty and I knew it. What I didn't know, what I was carefully not examining, was what he felt beneath the composed, deliberate surface of his attention. Whether the orchid and the meals and the fractional closeness when someone looked at me with architecture in their smile added up to something real, or were simply the behavior of a man so accustomed to acquiring what he decided he wanted that the acquisition had become reflexive. It was Mrs. Yoon who resolved that uncertainty, though not intentionally. 6 weeks after the Friday event, I was in the supply corridor collecting materials for the morning room when I heard her voice through the partially open door of her office, speaking to someone on the phone, in Korean, in the tone she reserved for conversations she considered private. My Korean was imperfect but serviceable, assembled from my grandmother's voice, and 2 years of evening classes I'd taken years ago for reasons I barely remembered now. I didn't stop walking, but I caught enough. He hasn't slept properly in weeks. No, I'm telling you, since the incident with the driver. The way he stands in the library when she doesn't know he's there yet. I kept moving. Set up my cart. Went to the morning room and folded throw blankets with hands that weren't entirely steady. The way he stands in the library when she doesn't know he's there yet. The image arrived fully formed and stayed. Hunho in the library doorway, before I'd registered his presence. Watching me work with that attention that I now understood was not the attention of an employer monitoring staff. Had never been that. I sat down in one of the morning room chairs, something I had never done, in 6 weeks, in any room of this house. and I pressed both hands flat against my knees and made myself think clearly. What I knew: I had come here for money. I had stayed because the work was consistent and the pay was honest, and I had convinced myself that was sufficient reason. I had spent 6 weeks watching a man who frightened half the world treat me with a gentleness so specific and deliberate it felt custom-made, and I had responded to it in every way except the one that would have required acknowledging what it was. What I also knew: this world had edges I couldn't see. The driver with the weighted jacket, the woman at the event with the sharp smile, the additional guards, the multiple phones, the way Junho's eyes moved automatically to every entrance and exit of any room he entered. Whatever he felt, whatever I felt, the life around him was dangerous in ways that were real and permanent, and not romantic in any sense that survived contact with actual consequence. I sat with both of those truths for a long time. Then I stood up and went to find him. He was in the study. The door was open, which I had learned meant he was between calls, a brief window of availability that the staff understood and the guards respected. I knocked on the frame. He looked up from the desk, registered my expression with an immediacy that told me he had been anticipating something like this moment, if not its precise shape. "Close the door," he said. I did. I remained near it, not quite in the room, not quite outside it, and I looked at him across the walnut desk and the 2 phones and the amber afternoon light, and I said what I had decided to say on the walk from the morning room. "I need to know what this is." He set down the pen he'd been holding, gave me his full attention, which was simply what he always gave me, and the familiarity of it made my chest ache in a way I hadn't anticipated. "What would you like it to be?" he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment, choosing as always. "What this is," he said carefully, "is something I haven't experienced before, and therefore don't have efficient language for. What I know is that I am more aware of where you are in this house than I am of most things that require my professional awareness. I know that the Friday event was the first social obligation in 3 years that I didn't want to leave early. I know that when I imagine this house without you in it, something in the calculation doesn't function." The room was very still around us. "I know what my life is," he continued. "I'm not going to present it as something cleaner than it is. There are things I've done and things I will do that exist outside the reach of ordinary justification. The world I operate in is dangerous in ways that are permanent, and anyone who is close to me carries some measure of that danger, simply by proximity." His eyes held mine without deflection. "I am telling you this directly because you deserve a complete picture, and because I think you already know most of it." "I do," I said. "Then the question is honest," he said. "And it deserves an honest answer rather than a managed one." He stood, came around the desk with that unhurried, deliberate movement, and stopped at a distance that required me to look up slightly to hold his gaze. "I want you here, not as staff, as mine, and I will be, I already am, more protective of you than is probably reasonable, because the people in my world look for weaknesses, and you would become one immediately. This is not a comfortable thing to offer someone." The word mine sat in the air between us, possessive, unambiguous, and delivered with a directness that was somehow more affecting than any softened version would have been. "I'm not a weakness," I said. "No," he said. "You're the opposite. That's the problem." I looked at him, at the scar along his jaw, and the deep, careful eyes and the burgundy tie, always perfect now, that had started all of this. And I thought about my mother and my grandmother, and the cramped apartment and every careful, contracted version of my life that I had constructed to avoid wanting things I couldn't afford. "If I stay," I said, "it has to be honest. All of it. Not managed, not protected from." Something in his face changed. Genuinely, visibly, the composed surface yielding to something underneath that was less certain and more real. "That will be difficult for me," he said. I know, I said. Do it anyway. What came after was not simple, and I won't pretend it was. There were nights when I lay awake aware of the specific weight of what I had chosen. The guards at the doors, the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the occasional cold assessment of people in Junho's world who looked at me and saw a liability. There were moments of fear that were genuine and grounded, not the atmospheric tension of those first 11 days, but the clearer, harder fear of someone who understands what she has walked toward. There was also this: Junho learning, imperfectly and with visible effort, to tell me things before they became crises. To come to the library not only when he was composed, but occasionally when he was not. Sitting in the chair by the window with his tie loosened and his second phone quiet, and his face carrying the weight of decisions I could not fix, but could, it turned out, simply be present beside. He was not easy. He was demanding in ways that were sometimes about control, and sometimes about the specific terror of someone who had lost things before and moved the furniture of his life accordingly. We argued. Not often, but honestly, the kind of arguments that required both people to hold their ground and then find the actual ground between them, which was harder and more worthwhile than either capitulation or avoidance. Minjung, the woman from the event with the architectural smile, proved herself a more persistent complication than I'd anticipated. She had history with Junho that predated me by years, and opinions about his choices that she expressed through channels I couldn't always see. It took time and one direct conversation between the three of us, in this very study, to resolve into something that resembled a boundary she ultimately respected, if not accepted. The man from the motor court, I learned eventually, in one of Junho's imperfect but improving attempts at honesty, had been connected to a dispute over territory that was settled in the months that followed, through means I was not present for, and did not ask to witness. What I asked was whether it was finished. Junho looked at me across the library, where we had been sitting in the early evening with books neither of us had been reading, and said yes with the particular weight of someone who means a thing completely. I believed him. Not naively. I had lived in this house long enough to understand the difference between managed reassurance and actual truth. This was actual truth. A year after my first morning on the estate, I stood in the library at 6:15, the same hour, the same gray and gold light, and watched Junho come through the doorway in a dark suit with a tie that was, for the first time in my memory, slightly askew. He had done it deliberately. I knew this because of the particular quality of his expression when he stopped in the center of the room and looked at me. That almost smile, more visible now than it had ever been in those early careful months, occupying more of his face. I crossed the room, reached up to his collar without being asked, found the narrow burgundy silk — he owned several, I had noticed, all the same shade — and straightened it with the same 3-second efficiency as the first time. But I didn't step back. His hand came up and covered mine, still at his collar, and held it there, warm and deliberate, the way he did everything. And neither of us said anything for a moment, because the room held it all already. The orchid on the windowsill, the meals outside the staff quarters door, the honest arguments and the imperfect revelations, and the specific quality of a silence between two people who have chosen each other with full knowledge of the cost. "You're going to be late," I said. "Yes," he said, and didn't move. Outside, the garden was coming into its spring colors, the roses rising back from their winter weight, the light finding angles through the trees that it couldn't reach in the colder months. Through the window, the motor court held the familiar black car, Mr. Park in the driver's seat with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, patient and unhurried. The house smelled like cedar and barley tea and the specific warmth of morning. I had come here for money and found something I hadn't known I was looking for. Not safety exactly, because safety was not the word for what existed in this complicated, guarded, carefully honest life. Something closer to being known, to being the person whose pause in the doorway was noticed, whose practical attention to the world was not a liability, but the thing that had started everything. I thought of my grandmother pressing dried persimmons into my palms like currency, and I understood now what she had been trying to give me. Not the persimmons, but the lesson beneath them. That small, ordinary things held in careful hands become exactly enough. Junho's hand was still over mine. His eyes were on my face with that complete, undivided attention that had never once, in an entire year, felt like anything other than exactly what it was. "Go," I told him softly. He lifted my hand from his collar, pressed his mouth to my knuckles, brief, certain, a punctuation mark rather than a question, and let go. I watched him cross the library, pause in the doorway to look back at me once with that expression I had learned to read completely. And then he was gone, his footsteps descending the stairs with the same unhurried certainty that had first told me, before I ever saw his face, that here was someone who had never needed to rush, because the world waited. And now, without entirely meaning to, so did I, gladly, and with both eyes open.